Michael Jordan was just trying to help a homeless man when a cop stormed in and snarled, "Step away from the vagrant or I'll put you in cuffs." The crowd froze. Phones came out. But instead of arguing, Jordan just smirked because he had a plan. What happened next exposed corruption, ruined a career, and turned an act of kindness into a movement. Stay till the end because this story will leave you shocked. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the sidewalk in an eerie glow as the squad car screeched to a halt. "You got 5 seconds to get away from that man, or I'll put you in cuffs," the cop growled, without realizing who he was talking to. Michael Jordan slowly turned his head, his sharp gaze locking onto the officer. He was dressed casually, black hoodie, dark jeans, and a pair of fresh sneakers. No bodyguards, no entourage, just him walking the city streets late at night, enjoying the quiet. But now the quiet was gone. A few feet away, an old homeless man sat hunched against the cold brick wall of an upscale restaurant. His thin frame shivered under layers of ragged clothing, his hands cupped together for warmth. Jordan had spotted him just moments ago. While the wealthy patrons inside the restaurant laughed over overpriced steaks, this man sat outside, forgotten. Jordan didn't think twice. He knelt down, slipped off his designer jacket, and draped it over the man's shoulders. Then, pulling out a few crisp $100 bills, he offered them with a small nod. The homeless man, Robert, as he introduced himself, hesitated. His eyes, weary and sunken, flickered with something close to disbelief. "People don't usually stop for me," he admitted, his voice rough from years of being ignored. Jordan opened his mouth to respond, but the sudden wail of a police siren cut through the air. Then came the voice, loud, authoritative, and already filled with suspicion. "Step away from the vagrant," Officer Grayson barked as he slammed his squad car door and stormed toward them. His boots clapped sharply against the pavement, one hand resting on his belt. Jordan remained kneeling beside Robert, his expression shifting into a frown. "I'm just helping him," he said, calm but firm. Grayson let out a sharp scoff, eyes scanning the scene like he had already made up his mind. "Helping?" He gave a mocking chuckle. "Looks more like a drug deal to me." The accusation made Robert shrink against the wall, his body tensing like he had been through this before. Jordan, on the other hand, didn't flinch. A tense silence stretched between them as the city noise faded into the background. The officer's fingers curled tighter around his belt, his stance wide and unyielding. Then in one slow, deliberate motion, Jordan rose to his full height, towering over the officer by nearly half a foot. His presence alone shifted the power dynamic in an instant. His voice, steady and controlled, carried an unmistakable weight. "You might want to rethink that." The power struggle had just begun, and Grayson had no idea who he was up against. Officer Grayson didn't recognize Michael Jordan. That was his first mistake. The second was assuming he could push him around. Grayson squared his shoulders, eyes narrowing as he took another step closer. His hand rested firmly on his belt, fingers hovering near his handcuffs. "Step back now," he ordered, his voice sharp, dripping with authority. Jordan didn't move. His expression remained calm, unreadable. The streetlights cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp lines of his jaw and the intensity in his eyes. "I just gave him money for food," he said smoothly, his voice steady. "What's the problem?" Grayson scoffed, shaking his head like he had heard this excuse 1,000 times before. "Guys like him don't need money. They need a cell." His gaze flicked down to Robert, curled up on the cold pavement, gripping Jordan's designer jacket like it was the only warmth he had left. Robert's eyes widened with fear. He had seen this before, felt this before. The way Grayson looked at him wasn't new. It was the look of someone who had already decided what he was worth. "Sir, Robert tried to explain, but before he could get the words out, Grayson grabbed his collar and shoved him back against the brick wall. The impact sent a sharp gasp through Robert's frail body. A few people passing by slowed their steps, their eyes darting toward the scene. The city was full of injustice like this. Most just chose to look away. But Jordan? He didn't look away. He stepped forward, his eyes darkening, his entire demeanor shifting from calm to something far more dangerous. "You just messed up." The words were quiet, but they cut through the night air like a blade. Grayson's smug expression faltered for the briefest moment, sensing the shift. Then, without hesitation, Jordan took another step forward and Grays immediately reached for his handcuffs. He thought this was just another arrest, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. Grayson thought this was just another arrest, until the crowd started forming. The metallic clink of handcuffs echoed through the quiet night as Officer Grayson pulled them from his belt. His movements sharp and practiced, his stance widened, his grip firm as he held them up, the streetlights reflecting off the cold steel. He had done this 1,000 times before, and tonight would be no different. "Turn around," he ordered, his voice steady, unwavering. To him, this was just procedure, a routine takedown of another troublemaker on the streets. But Michael Jordan didn't move. He stood still, his expression calm, unreadable. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation in his posture. The cold breeze ruffled the hood of his sweatshirt, but he remained rooted in place. His presence alone carried a weight that even Grayson could feel, though he refused to acknowledge it. Robert, still huddled against the brick wall, clutched the expensive jacket Jordan had given him, his frail fingers tightening around the fabric. His breath was shaky, uneven, his sunken eyes darting between Jordan and the officer. He had seen plenty of arrests before, enough to know how these things usually played out, but this time felt different. A few feet away, the city continued to hum with life, but there was a shift in the atmosphere. A couple exiting a nearby restaurant hesitated on the curb, glancing toward the unfolding scene. A young woman holding a shopping bag whispered something to her friend, their heads turning in unison. Across the street, a man mid-phone call stopped speaking, his gaze locked on the towering figure standing firm in front of the officer. Jordan's voice finally broke through the quiet tension. "You sure you want to do this, officer?" His tone was level, not threatening, but there was something in it, something unshakable. Grayson's grip on the cuffs tightened. He wasn't about to be challenged, not by some random guy in a hoodie. "I don't care who you think you are," he shot back, irritation creeping into his voice. "Step back or—" A voice from the gathering crowd interrupted him. "Wait, is that Michael Jordan?" Grayson barely reacted. His eyes remained locked on Jordan as he scoffed. "I don't care if you're the president," he muttered. "You're interfering with police business." But the dynamic had already shifted. More people had stopped to watch. More whispers spread through the air. And then, the glow of phone screens being raised. Cameras started recording. Grayson's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of every lens now pointed at him, but he refused to back down. This was his scene, his authority. But the whispers only grew louder. A man in the back of the crowd nudged his friend. "That's gotta be him, right?" And then, from the very back of the growing crowd, a loud voice boomed through the night. "Hey, that's MJ!" In an instant, the arrest wasn't just an arrest. It was about to become a national spectacle. Officer Grayson had just made a public enemy of himself, and he didn't even know it yet. The energy in the air shifted instantly. The second that voice boomed from the crowd, "Hey, that's MJ!" It was as if someone had flipped a switch. Heads turned, conversations stopped. And then, all at once, people stepped forward. "That's Michael Jordan," someone shouted. "No way! The Michael Jordan?" Another voice echoed, the disbelief thick. A man in a business suit squinted, as if trying to confirm what his brain refused to believe. "Holy hell, it is him!" The murmurs turned into full-blown chatter, excitement mixing with confusion. Grayson's eyes darted around, registering the shift in the crowd's energy. More people had stopped on the sidewalk, drawn in by the commotion. A couple of restaurant-goers had stepped outside, their curiosity piqued. And most importantly, every single one of them had their phones up, recording. Jordan stood there unbothered, his towering frame making him impossible to ignore. "Let him go!" a woman called from the crowd, her voice rising with the collective outrage. A younger man, maybe in his 20s, crossed his arms. "You're really about to arrest Michael Jordan? You trying to lose your job, bro?" Grayson's fingers tensed around his cuffs. His confidence flickered, just for a second, but he recovered quickly. His pride, his authority, his control over the situation was slipping, and he refused to let it go. "I don't care who he is," he snapped, his voice louder now, trying to reassert dominance. "Step back, all of you." But it was too late. The moment had already passed. The crowd wasn't stepping back. They were closing in, their expressions hardening, their voices growing louder. Robert, still clutching Jordan's jacket like a lifeline, blinked up at him in awe. You're really Michael Jordan?" His voice trembled with disbelief, as if he couldn't trust his own eyes. Jordan let out a small, amused exhale and shrugged. "Last time I checked, The crowd roared. Some people laughed, others cheered, and more phones went up, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. The weight of the moment pressed down on Grayson, his once certain grip on the situation unraveling by the second. His jaw tightened, his face burned. He was losing control. Jordan turned to face him fully now, that infamous smirk curling at the edge of his lips. His tone was calm. Too calm. "I think your little power trip is about to end, officer." Grayson was quickly realizing he had just picked a fight he couldn't win. Grayson's confidence wavered, but he wasn't backing down yet. The growing crowd was no longer just a bystander to the scene. They were a force. Phones were pointed straight at Officer Grayson, capturing his every move. The murmurs had turned into outright discussions, people debating whether they were about to witness an officer lose his badge in real time. And yet Grayson stood his ground. His pulse was racing, his authority slipping, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. Not in front of this many people. Not in front of him. Just as he opened his mouth to snap another order, the sound of tires screeching against pavement made him pause. A second squad car pulled up, the flashing lights casting sharp shadows across the street. The driver's side door swung open, and Officer Diaz stepped out. Diaz was younger than Grayson, leaner, with sharp eyes that had seen too much in too little time. He adjusted his belt as he walked over, glancing at the crowd before settling his gaze on Jordan. The second he recognized him, his entire body stiffened. "Oh, shh." His voice cut off as his brain caught up with the situation. Jordan, still relaxed, offered a slight nod. The crowd was already waiting for what Diaz would do next. Grayson turned slightly, lowering his voice just enough so only Diaz could hear. "Don't say a word," he muttered through clenched teeth. "I already started this. Can't back down now." Diaz exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "Grayson, do you have any idea who you're messing with?" Grayson's jaw clenched. He knew. Of course he knew. But that wasn't the point anymore. This wasn't just about enforcing the law. This was about saving face. "I don't care who he is," Grayson said, his voice just loud enough for Jordan to hear. "He's interfering with police business." Jordan, who had been silent until now, finally moved. He stepped forward, the small shift in his posture somehow making the air feel heavier. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. With a slow, deliberate motion, he folded his arms across his chest. The way he did it, controlled, confident, sent a clear message. "Then let's see how that works out for you." Grayson had been so focused on not losing that he hadn't realized he had already lost. The tension in the air had transformed into something almost suffocating. What had started as a routine encounter, a cop throwing his weight around, had escalated into something far bigger than Grayson had anticipated. The crowd had doubled in size, then tripled. People who had merely been passing by were now stopping, phones raised, whispering among themselves. News vans were already pulling up at the curb, cameras rolling. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was a story. Officer Diaz shifted uncomfortably. He had been on the force long enough to know when a situation was spiraling beyond control. This was one of those moments. His fingers twitched over his radio before he made the call he knew was necessary. "Chief, we got a problem," Diaz muttered, voice low but urgent. Grayson snapped his head toward him, his face contorting with frustration. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed. Diaz didn't look at him. His eyes remained fixed on the crowd, on the flashing phone cameras, on the growing number of witnesses. "Saving your ass," he said bluntly. A beat of silence. Then from the radio clip to Diaz's chest, a static-filled response crackled through. "On my way." Grayson's stomach twisted. Minutes later, the low rumble of an engine sent a ripple through the crowd. People turned their heads just in time to see a sleek black SUV pulling up to the scene. The back door swung open with deliberate slowness, and a pair of polished black boots stepped onto the pavement. The police chief had arrived. Chief Morales wasn't just another officer in uniform. He was the kind of man who didn't tolerate embarrassment. A tall, broad-shouldered figure in a tailored dark blue uniform, he carried himself with the authority of someone who had spent decades commanding respect. His gaze swept over the scene, the crowd, the flashing cameras, Michael Jordan standing calmly with his arms crossed, before finally settling on Grayson. Grayson, for the first time that night, felt something cold grip his spine. His throat went dry. "Oh, no." The moment Chief Morales locked eyes with him, Grayson knew he was in deep, deep trouble. The police chief didn't look happy, and he was looking straight at Grayson. The weight of Chief Morales' stare felt heavier than the bulletproof vest strapped to Grayson's chest. The growing crowd had gone eerily silent, everyone waiting to see how this would play out. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic, the occasional shudder of a camera, and the faint static from the chief's radio. With slow, deliberate steps, Morales walked forward. His sharp eyes swept over the scene. The sea of recording phones, Officer Diaz looking tense, Robert still clutching the expensive jacket Jordan had given him. And then there was Jordan himself, standing tall, arms crossed, unreadable. Morales finally stopped in front of Grayson. His jaw was clenched so tight it looked like he might crack a tooth. "Tell me you didn't just put Michael Jordan in cuffs," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Grayson swallowed hard, trying to keep his posture straight. This was his last chance to spin this. "He was interfering with police business," Grayson said quickly. His voice wasn't as steady as he wanted it to be. Morales slowly raised an eyebrow, letting the words sink in. He tilted his head slightly, his expression shifting from frustration to something closer to disbelief. "Interfering?" he repeated, his voice laced with quiet fury. "By doing what exactly?" Grayson's throat went dry, but he had already committed to the lie. He couldn't back down now. "He was handing off money in a known crime area. Looked like a drug deal to me." Morales exhaled sharply through his nose, nostrils flaring. He turned his head slightly, looking at Robert, the frail, homeless man who still sat huddled on the sidewalk, his eyes wide with anxiety. Morales took in the scene, the fresh bills clutched in Robert's trembling hands, the way his thin fingers gripped the designer jacket like it was the only thing keeping him warm. Morales turned back to Grayson, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then with absolute coldness, he said, "By giving a homeless man money?" The silence that followed was deafening. Grayson's confidence crumbled. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. There was no good way to spin this, no excuse that could justify the ridiculousness of what he had done. His badge suddenly felt heavier on his chest. Jordan, who had been watching the entire exchange with quiet amusement, finally spoke. He let out a small, knowing smirk and said, "I think he just hates charity." The crowd exploded into murmurs, and for the first time, Grayson realized he had just lost control of the entire narrative. Grayson had skeletons in his closet, and Jordan was about to open the door. A heavy silence settled over the street, thick with tension and unspoken truce. The energy had shifted, the authority Grayson once commanded now slipping through his fingers like sand. The flashing lights of the patrol cars reflected off the phones raised in the air, each one capturing the moment, each one waiting for what would happen next. And then, Robert spoke. "This ain't the first time he's done this," he murmured, his voice rough and tired, yet carrying the weight of something that had been buried for too long. The words sliced through the air like a blade. A murmur spread through the crowd, at first uncertain, then growing louder. People exchanged glances, eyebrows raised, trying to make sense of what they had just heard. "Wait, what did he say? Did he just say, 'not the first time'? What does that mean?" Officer Grayson's entire body stiffened. His nostrils flared slightly, his jaw clenching so tight it seemed like he was grinding his teeth. His hand, which had instinctively twitched toward his belt before, remained frozen in place. He had been desperately trying to keep control of the situation, but now for the first time, there was real fear in his eyes. Michael Jordan turned his head slowly, his tall frame casting a shadow over Robert as he met his gaze. The curiosity in his eyes had sharpened into something else, a quiet, deliberate focus. "You got something to say, Robert?" Jordan asked, his voice smooth but firm, a direct invitation. Robert hesitated. His thin fingers tightened around the designer jacket draped over his shoulders, the expensive fabric feeling foreign against his weathered skin. For a brief moment, it seemed as if he might back down, might let the moment pass like he had so many times before. But then, something changed. Maybe it was the way Grayson's lip curled, his fingers flexing into a fist at his side. Maybe it was the way the crowd had stopped whispering, their eyes locked onto Robert, waiting for him to stay silent, just like he always had. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat painful but necessary. "Yeah," Robert said, his voice stronger this time. "I do." The entire street went still. A breeze passed through, carrying the distant honk of a car. But in this moment, everything else faded. All that remained was Robert speaking his truth. Grayson took a slow step forward, his posture rigid. His voice dropped, venom laced between the words. "Shut your damn mouth," he growled under his breath, just loud enough for Robert to hear. But Robert didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward. His shoulders, hunched from years of living in the margins, squared slightly. His gaze, tired but resolute, lifted until he was looking directly at Grayson. And then he said the words that shattered everything. "This cop's been stealing from homeless people for years." The crowd erupted, gasps ringing out like gunfire. Grayson had lost control, but worse, his past had just come back to haunt him. The moment Robert's accusation echoed through the street, the reaction was instantaneous. The crowd, which had already been teetering on the edge of outrage, exploded. Gasps turned into shouts. Murmurs turned into full-blown demands. "Did he just say stealing? This dude's been robbing homeless people? Oh, hell no! Fire him!" It started with one voice, then another, then a chorus of angry demands. "Fire him! Get him off the force! Lock him up!" Officer Grayson's face twisted into something between anger and panic. His mind raced for a way out, but there was no escape. Not this time. The flashing red and blue lights that once symbolized his authority now only highlighted the fall of it. The reflection of dozens of recording phone screens glowed in his widened eyes, each one a silent witness to his downfall. Chief Morales stood motionless, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He had been in law enforcement for decades, and he knew the damage was done. He could already see how this would play out. By morning, this would be on every news station in the country. The chief closed his eyes briefly, exhaled, then stepped forward. "Officer Grayson," he said, his voice heavy, his tone leaving no room for argument. Grayson turned sharply, desperate for a lifeline. "Chief, this is ridiculous. These people don't know what they're talking about. You're gonna take the word of some vagrant over me?" His voice cracked slightly at the end, betraying the fear creeping into his chest. Morales didn't react. He simply extended a hand. "Turn in your badge." A collective gasp swept through the crowd, quickly replaced by a roar of approval. Grayson's breath caught in his throat. He froze. His hands, once so steady when gripping a baton or a firearm, shook at his sides. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out at first. Finally, when he did speak, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "Wait, what?" His entire world had just come crashing down, and for the first time in his career, he had no control over what happened next. The internet moved faster than any breaking news channel, and by the time Officer Grayson's badge hit the pavement, the world was already watching. Within minutes, the first videos had hit social media. By the time Grayson's stunned expression was captured on film, his final desperate plea of "Wait, what?" had already become an instant meme. The footage of Michael Jordan standing tall, unshaken, while an entire police force unraveled before him was cinematic perfection. The hashtag #JordanJustice started trending worldwide within the hour. Clips of the incident flooded every major platform. TikTok was filled with dramatic replays, some edited like blockbuster trailers, complete with slow-motion shots of Jordan smirking just before Grayson's downfall. Instagram pages posted side-by-side comparisons, Michael Jordan on the court-breaking ankles and Michael Jordan on the street-breaking egos. News anchors replayed the footage over and over, their voices filled with barely contained shock. In a stunning turn of events, legendary athlete and billionaire Michael Jordan was nearly arrested last night while helping a homeless man, only for the situation to backfire on the officer responsible. The fallout? Swift and severe. On live television, Robert sat in a studio, wearing the same designer jacket Jordan had given him. But this time he didn't look like a forgotten man. He looked like someone who had finally been heard. The anchor leaned forward, eyes full of sympathy. "Robert, when you spoke up against Officer Grayson, did you expect this reaction?" Robert let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Nah, I figured they'd just ignore me like always. But Michael? He didn't. And now? Nobody can." The clip spread like wildfire. Cameras flashed as reporters surrounded Jordan outside the Pinnacle, eager for a statement. His face remained unreadable as microphones were shoved in his direction. Then, one journalist's voice cut through the chaos. "Mr. Jordan, after everything that's happened, what's next?" Jordan finally stopped, turned to face the crowd, and let the slightest smirk cross his lips. Now we fixed this city. The internet had crowned him a hero, but Jordan was about to turn this moment into something even bigger. The viral firestorm surrounding the incident had barely begun to settle when Michael Jordan made his next move, one that no one saw coming. Standing outside the pinnacle, the same place where just days ago he had flipped the script on exclusivity, Jordan faced a crowd of reporters, flashing cameras, and a city that now hung on his every word. The air buzzed with anticipation, the streets packed with people eager to hear what he had to say. A journalist near the front raised her mic. "Mr. Jordan, after exposing Officer Grayson and making national headlines, what's your next step?" Jordan glanced around, letting the moment breathe. He had spent his life playing in arenas filled with tens of thousands, but this was bigger. "I've made a lot of money in my life," he finally said, his voice smooth, deliberate. "But money isn't what defines you. It's what you do with it." He paused, then continued. "That's why today I'm launching the Jordan Housing and Opportunity Initiative, a fund dedicated to helping the homeless population in this city get the resources they need, not just food and shelter, but real opportunities to rebuild their lives." The crowd erupted. Applause, cheers. Even the reporters, trained to stay neutral, couldn't help but exchange impressed glances. The announcement wasn't just a reaction to the scandal, it was a power move. Jordan gestured to his side. Standing there freshly cleaned up was Robert. Gone were the tattered clothes, replaced by a fitted blazer, a button-down shirt, and a confidence in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The difference was staggering. Jordan clapped a firm hand on Robert's shoulder. "This man right here. He's proof that people don't need handouts. They need chances. And that's why I'm giving him one." Robert blinked, shifting awkwardly. "Wait, what?" Jordan smirked. "Starting today, Robert's got a job at one of my companies. Full salary, full benefits." The crowd lost it. Robert's mouth fell open. His hands shook slightly as he looked down at himself, at the fresh clothes, at the people cheering for him. A man who, just days ago, had been invisible. His voice cracked slightly as he whispered, "I don't know what to say." Jordan grinned. "Say you'll show up to work on time." Robert laughed, a genuine warm sound, one that had been buried for years under hardship. He shook his head in disbelief, exhaling deeply before finally looking Jordan in the eye. "Man, you really are different." The world had already seen Jordan dominate the court, but now he was changing the game in real life. Jordan left the scene with a final message, one the world wouldn't forget. The energy in the air was electric, the kind of moment that felt bigger than itself. The flashing cameras, the hushed murmurs of the crowd, the stunned faces of reporters who had expected a scandal but instead witnessed a legacy being redefined. Michael Jordan had done something no one saw coming, not just exposing corruption, not just standing up for justice, but proving that power wasn't about wealth. It was about choice, about what you did when you had the chance to make a difference. As he shook Robert's hand one last time, a small voice cut through the noise. "Mr. Jordan?" The crowd parted slightly, revealing a young boy, no older than 10, standing near the front. His wide eyes locked onto Jordan with pure curiosity, his small hands clutching a worn basketball. He looked nervous but determined. Jordan turned, crouching slightly so they were at eye level. "What's up, little man?" The boy hesitated, then finally asked, "Why help him?" It was a simple question, but somehow it carried the weight of the entire night. Jordan studied him for a moment, then smiled. He reached out, gently tapping the kid's basketball before responding. "Because real greatness," Jordan said, his voice calm but powerful, "isn't about what you have, it's about what you give." The crowd fell silent. The words landed heavier than anything else that had been said all night. People had come expecting drama. Instead, they had witnessed a lesson in real power. A reporter standing nearby whispered, "Did you get that on camera?" Another nodded, her phone still recording. The moment was already being uploaded, already on its way to millions of screens across the world. Jordan stood back up, glancing at Robert one last time before slipping his hands into his pockets. "You good?" Robert nodded, still overwhelmed. Yeah, I think I am." With that, Jordan turned toward the crowd, gave them a small nod, and walked away. No grand exit, no need for applause. But the internet wasn't done with him yet. By the time the first video hit social media, it exploded. The clip of Jordan kneeling, giving that final lesson, spread like wildfire. 100 million views in hours. A billionaire hadn't just given away money. He had given away wisdom. The world had always known Michael Jordan as a champion, but now he had just changed the game in a way no one expected.